Hey everyone, happy Friday. Welcome to another edition of Time for Agape. This episode is so important. And so I want to say right at the top of the show, please share this with your friends. I really believe that it's just an essential thing for the hour in which we live in the state of Minnesota. You know, it's interesting because there was an election last November. Maybe you were aware, and we got a new president, and that president is really favorable towards Christians and towards the issues that we hold near and dear to our hearts here at Agape First, and with many in the church. But we want to make sure that believers don't get lazy or lackadaisical because the battle is still at hand. And as I was thinking about the show today, one of the verses that came to mind was 1 Peter 5:8, which talks about being vigilant, staying alert, because our enemy, the devil, he prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he would devour. So we have an enemy. There are no ceasefires in the kingdom of God. And just because there's been some change in leadership doesn't mean that we can, step out of the battle. It's just, we're in it. We're in it, and we need to be in it to win it, okay? Especially here in the state of Minnesota, there's still some battles that we need to win, particularly around the issues of sex and gender. And, when we talk about the issue of gender, we're really talking about the image of God. Because in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, we see that the image of God is revealed on the earth through men and women. Both, not one, not the other, but both. We need men and we need women. But what's happening is there is a global assault taking place on the image of God, and the enemy wants to eradicate God's image from the earth. And so there's a lot of blurring of the lines that were drawn, that were set by God at the beginning of time. Male and female, he created them. And so as believers and as people who want to help you think about these issues in a biblical way, we really want to encourage you to understand the image of God, what it means that you are an image bearer. It's a profound honor. This is a holiness issue. This is a beauty of the Lord issue. And it really is something that can have devastating impact on society if the image of God is eradicated. Now, that's not going to happen, but I mean, that's the attempt of the enemy. Well, I want to bring on our co-hosts and our guests for today. We've got a big show. Darren and Gracie, as always, are with me. Hey, guys.
Hi.
Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. And I want to bring on some very dear friends, Renee and Becca from Minnesota Family Counsel and True North Legal. Honestly, they are my heroes. They have done some amazing things in our state and in our nation, and I just want to honor them for that. They're standing in the gap in a way, and there's a cost. And so I just want to say thank you, guys. Thank you for being with us today.
Good to be here with you, Nate.
Hello, friends. Thanks so much for having me. I think this is my second time on this.
Yeah. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So many things bring us back here, right?
I know, right? I know. It's like, can't we catch our breath? Well, our viewers will probably be somewhat up to speed because we covered a lot of, the last few years of legislative cycles. The last couple were, man, it was a fight. And here we are again. And so that's why we're doing this show today, is just to highlight some of the legislation that's being introduced, and just kind of help people think through this in a biblical way. But before we do that, you guys just introduce yourselves and share a little bit about your role in this whole endeavor.
Yeah, I can go first.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Becca.
I'm Becca Delahunt, and I work for Minnesota Family Counsel as the Director of Public Policy. And Family Policy Council movement, I think there's almost 40 family policy councils across the U.S., and they were started by Focus on the Family a long time ago to work on issues of life, family, and religious freedom. And the organizations all have become independent, and so I work for the Minnesota chapter, and I work with Renee.
Awesome. Go ahead, Renee.
Thanks, Becca. Well, my name is Renee Carlson, and I work for the Minnesota Family Council as well. But I run our legal initiative, which is called True North Legal, and it is a public interest law firm, then partnership with the Minnesota Family Council. So I get to work on educational issues, helping people understand legislation and lawsuits and how it impacts us, not just as Minnesotans, but as Christians. I work in public policy a lot with Rebecca, and that's one of my greatest joys. She is a tremendous partner and sister in Christ. And then also in the courts. There's a big battle to be had on each of those fronts, and I'm privileged to be doing this and to be doing good work. I thought it was interesting, Rebecca, that you mentioned focus on the family, because years ago when I just became a Christian, I had this really strong conviction about working with families and helping to really stand in the gap with, as you mentioned, Nate, the assault on families and on people of faith is hostile, and it will continue to be on this side of heaven. And so I've just always had this conviction that I wanted to work in this space. I worked in the legislature for a bit and went to law school, and here I am. So it's a great joy and privilege to be here with all of you and to be doing this really good work.
Wow. Well, again, thank you guys for what you're doing. I know it means a lot of late nights and long hours and so many behind the scenes things that nobody knows are taking place. Why don't we start with the ERA, which is back. This is something that we were facing last year, and of course there was a big push to really take away a lot of our religious liberties. It didn't go through, but here we are again. Can you tell us a little bit of the history and where we're at now?
Yes, absolutely. I can get into the history of the ERA. It's been around for a long time, Nate. When it first came out, had a lot more to do with protecting abortion rights, as they would say, protecting those rights. And yet it has expanded to really become an amendment to protect gender identity and what I like to call self-identification. So every individual to be able to self-identify as they would prefer. And this issue comes up regularly in legislative sessions. There was a big push last year. We thought it might end up getting passed in the legislature. And presumably when these bills get passed, they get sent on to voters in a general election, whether to amend the Constitution. So you folks will, I'm sure, remember the marriage amendment that got passed by both chambers of the legislature, and then voters voted upon that a little over a decade ago. But the ERA, like I said, we thought it would pass last year. At the last minute, it did not pass, but it included a change that we haven't seen typically in ERAs. Usually they include protections for abortion, and most recent additions include this gender identity piece. But last year's version did not include protections for religious freedom, which was highly concerning. Yes, our state constitution includes the First Amendment. However, this new addition would show which rights would get priority protection, and that is abortion and gender identity. And so I'll let Renee chime in here on any of the legal aspects that you would like to share, Renee.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Well, that's a great point. The ERA is what they're calling the Equal Rights Amendment, and we call it the supposed Equal Rights Amendment, or the so-called Equal Rights Amendment, because as Rebecca mentioned, it doesn't promote equality or establish equality for all people in Minnesota, it actually creates kind of a super right if it became a constitutional amendment for things like gender identity and abortion. And it does that based on, yep, this language that you have right here. And admittedly, I'm on a screen that's a little small, and so I don't have everything committed to memory. But with it, because of the language, it's changing things a lot here in Minnesota. We have the Minnesota Human Rights Act, and that protects people from discrimination. But this just takes it to another level. It basically puts different categories in tension with each other and in conflict with one another, particularly with the new added protections for, quote, gender identity and gender expression. So I know Rebecca mentioned the omission of religion specifically, and that's problematic from a legal perspective for a couple of reasons. First of all, this so-called Equal Rights Amendment would be the most current law if it passed and if it became a constitutional amendment, which I'll let Rebecca discuss in a minute. But that just shows from a legislative interpretation perspective, like, what is a priority, or basically the most recent thing that was passed, the courts could look to as the highest priority. So if they see that the word religion isn't in there, courts will be left to wonder and interpret whether the legislature meant to just leave it out or kind of subvert the rights for religious people. And how does that, create a tension? Well, people of all faiths, not just Christians, have certain beliefs about men and women and human sexuality. Some people only hire men for certain reasons. Men are in certain positions and women are in certain positions for certain reasons. But probably, most important and most relatable to people watching here would be just like you said, the Genesis creation of men and women, and the reality that there are biological differences between us, and that means something. And so religious people and religious organizations could be forced to acquiesce to positions on gender ideology and hiring and using their facilities and applying for grants. And basically, like, to exist within the marketplace in Minnesota and within our culture here in Minnesota. If this passed, we would have to go along with the gender ideologues' thoughts on gender expression and gender identity. So that's quite concerning for people of faith. It's essentially like it's telling us that we have to subscribe to the state mandated religion of truth instead of being able to exist as we have for many years with the truth of God in a free country and in a free state. So that's problematic. And as Rebecca mentioned, this also gets into the issues of women and the longstanding rights that we've had as women and that we've fought for in this country and in this state. Women's sports is a big one that's come up lately. I'm sure a lot of people have been following that. That's been getting a lot of traction. And that's really just the tip of the spear. It reflects, again, that cultural conflict that you talked about, Nate. For us, it's not just about sports. It's about defining God's good design for men and women and illustrating that there are differences. And what do you know? Science proves God's truth, and that, men are physiologically altogether different, and that gives them an advantage in sports. We see that this also as a huge conflict for women's prisons, for schools, even for free speech. So there's kind of a list of ways that this so-called Equal Rights Amendment could impact us as Minnesotans, but that's just kind of the high level.
Right. So, Renee, is religion removed from this latest bill that's been introduced?
Yeah.
Correct. No, there's
it's missing in the list.
Yes.
It's not in here.
It's not in the list.
Notable missing. I think Nate and Renee alluded to the fundamental issue with the ERA. It sounds like a good thing, right? We want everybody to be protected, and yet it's really all about trying to create your own reality and making sure everyone aligns their behavior with your own recognized personal identity. And that's just does not reflect the created world in which we live. We did not create ourselves. We live in an order in which God created. And so we don't get to determine someday, hey, I want to just, sign away on a paper that I'm a male and now I'm entitled to all, male spaces and all of that. But where it really comes into conflict, of course, is females and children. It really impacts and poses a lot of harm to women and children.
And you mentioned, Nate, you mentioned the current administration and some of the executive orders that have been passed. And so we know from a federal perspective that the administration is enforcing what actually even recently one of the federal courts has said, which are there are two sexes. There are men and there are women. And so the administration is going to interpret the law as such. There, specifically, laws like Title IX that protect women and girls' athletic and educational opportunities. They're going to read the law to mean that it gives women certain opportunities because for a long time, they never had those. And so for a while, even from the court's perspective, this ability to make distinctions based on sex, based on the fact of our understanding that men and women are different, has not been a problem. So, in civil rights law, you're eventually going to have some sort of conflict, but there has to be enough play in the joints to be able to function as a society with the understanding that men and women are different. Sometimes we do make choices, and you might even call it like discrimination, but it's not invidious discrimination where it's hateful or for some very bad reasons. It's actually making a distinction and acknowledging there are differences and living in accordance with it, because sometimes those differences make a difference, particularly with women and their opportunities.
Absolutely. And, it was a beautiful thing in the President's State of the Union address when he said, boys are boys and girls are girls, and you're perfect in the body God gave you. And I think that there was a collective kind of sigh of relief because somebody, in leadership was, just simply saying something that's common sense that we would have said for all of history past. It's only been recently that this has been such an issue. But as you guys know, and just to underscore what you've already said, this is something that has a devastating impact on children when it comes to, so-called gender affirming care and what they're wanting to do to kids. And it has lifelong repercussions. And of course, we're seeing a huge detransition movement, kind of emerging because people are getting to their 20s and they're saying, wait a minute, that was a mistake. And now I have to live with that for the rest of my life. So it seems like it's heating up in terms of, it's really two worldviews. It's the biblical worldview, and it's the kingdom of darkness and their worldview. But we know that the enemy, his MO is he steals, he kills, and destroys.
Right.
And that's exactly what this legislation would do for women and children. And I think about, the stories we're hearing about the injuries that girls are experiencing because boys are just physically stronger, So the impact is huge and it's far reaching.
Absolutely. I think it's interesting, this ERA, it creates protection for gender identity, and that really cannot be separated from what they call gender affirming care.
Right.
Which I think for a lot of us who haven't considered that can be kind of a foreign concept, but the bill author, Representative Finke, talked about this on the House chamber floor regarding a different bill last year. And he's a male, he identifies as a woman, but he shared, he said, gender affirming care makes us who we are. And we fundamentally disagree with that concept, but I think that that's really what is implied by this ERA when it says there will be constitutional protection for gender identity and gender expression. It necessarily implies that gender affirming care will be protected, and there's no age specified, so that goes toward children as well. So we're talking about puberty blockers and opposite sex hormones for minors who aren't, their brains aren't fully developed and they're not exactly sure what they're doing. It's really insane that we talk to young children about freezing their eggs, right? Or those kinds of concepts. They have no idea what it means to their fertility.
Right.
And so, Yeah, this just has such devastating implications for society. You put it so well, Nate. The devil comes to steal, kill, and destroy, and it can be really obviously seen in how this would impact Minnesota's culture. And I did want to say, we're bringing this up today, even though it was tabled yesterday, because this issue just comes up year after year, and so we're
Yep.
thankful that it was tabled yesterday in committee. Which means that it's not moving forward in the process right now. And I don't expect it to move forward much this year. But this particular bill is live until the end of the 2026 session. And then I don't expect it to be going away soon. Although I will say the cultural understanding of this issue has grown recently. And the fact that President Trump has made this such a big issue for his administration, which is wonderful, standing for truths of biology and differences between males and females. More people are understanding that this is a significant issue, but we're sharing this with all of you because I don't think it will go away for a long time. And so we have to continue to make the case for truth and for protecting children and women as well.
Well, and if you're
Absolutely.
so dedicated to, oh, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine, Renee. I was actually going to ask you, just let's get a little specific and let's talk about churches. If this bill were to ever pass, you know, so the scenario could be a transgendered person applies for the church secretary position or worship leader, or a job in the church. Tell us a little bit about how this would really impact churches.
Well, I mean, even last year, just as a little bit of a deviation, but it makes the point, is that we had to fight for protection for religious organizations in the Minnesota Human Rights Act. And we saw the legislature try to narrow those protections to say, if you are a minister as we describe and as we understand it to be, then you will be protected. So they're just trying to narrow and chip away at the protections and autonomy that churches have. And that would apply, again, to like hiring, facilities usage, all sorts of ways that the church does its ministry. And I think what, people that are not Christians often might not understand is we don't do these things as Christians as a check the box. We do them because we're motivated by our calling as believers to serve others. When we work, even if we're doing an administrative position or something that seems distinctly different than, a holy position like a pastor, we're still doing it for the glory of God. That's what we're called to do. And so everything we do is motivated by that. They're trying to chip away and say, well, for example, like I think you mentioned, a church or even a religious school might not be able to hire somebody based on their religious qualifications if those qualifications are inconsistent with the so-called ERA, meaning if they don't champion gender identity, then they might be running afoul of the law and risk lawsuits and other penalties. It could be some sort of chasing after from the Department of Human Rights, where the Department of Human Rights would file a complaint, and it could now be a state or a federal lawsuit against them. And we know, as nonprofits, the last thing we want to do is use our money to spend on legal fees and expenses or attorney's fees of the other team. So, or the other side. It does jeopardize these parachurch ministries, churches, and religious organizations. And again, it goes back to what I said. It tells them that you must subscribe to the government's view of equality and the government's view of men and women, not your own religious beliefs. Right.
Darren, you had something you wanted to say.
Yeah, I was hoping, Renee, you kind of alluded to it in 23, they passed the update to the Human Rights Act where and it was just addressing, it was Lee Finke addressing the transgender issue. And then it became law, it passed, and then it became effective. And then Harry Niska came forward in a committee hearing and said, oh, when you updated this, you didn't put an exception into the religious section where, religious organizations have an exception for not having to hire people based on sexual orientation, right? And he said, well, but you didn't put the exception in for this transgender thing. And we think that you forgot it. So it's a cleanup bill, to clean up that text. And Lee Finke, to some extent, or whoever it was, if you could explain, like, I remember them saying something like, no, this wasn't a mistake. We did this. we're in your schools, we're in your universities, you have to hire us. Like, how did that go? And then how did the church respond? Because I remember we had Becca on and we were talking about that very thing, and then it passes, and like, how did it get passed without any church? What was the church's lack of involvement? How'd that go?
I
And
think
what's
there,
this
if
time?
I'm understanding, there's two issues, and Rebecca, jump in here if I miss something. But there was the part of legislation that passed that removed protections for people who are attracted, have a physical or sexual attraction to minors. That is the piece that was changed in the definition of the Minnesota Human Rights Act. But also there was a change in this Minnesota Human Rights Act to the exemptions for religious organizations. And that's what I would just alluded to when I talked about, the tip to why the so-called Equal Rights Amendment would be even worse than what happened with the Minnesota Human Rights Act. So there was so much going on, so much fast and furious between 2023 and 2024. And we were, trying to navigate, kind of playing whack-a-mole with all of the so-called trifectas legislation, and complete U-turn from what Minnesota has always been into a extremely progressive state, that they just kind of slipped in a change to the Minnesota Human Rights Act. And they didn't update the religious exemption because they added protections for gender identity. And in order to keep that exemption for churches and religious organizations, they had to also add that word into the exemptions, and they didn't. So as a matter of legal statutory interpretation, words matter. And so that omission gives the courts, again, an opportunity to say, well, I actually don't think that you meant to give these religious organizations these protections or let them operate based on their religious beliefs. I think you're asking them to subscribe to your government view. And so that did happen in 2023. So in 2024, when we had an opportunity to go into committee, that was discussed, as you said, Darren, and the committee chair said, no, this wasn't an accident. This was on purpose. And also the commissioner of the Department of Human Rights came in, and they came in to actually make other fixes on the Minnesota Human Rights Act bill. And in fact, doubled down and said, no, we don't need to change this. This was intentional. So it was something that slipped through in a fast and furious session. But when it was recognized and brought to the surface, we actually had a lot of participation from churches and people of faith. I worked a lot with the Minnesota Catholic Conference. I met a couple of imams throughout this and a couple of Jewish rabbis. We had press conferences. We had a big rally in the rotunda. So it was something that I think, it was snuck in, and there was an admission that it was on purpose. Unfortunately, that happened, and thankfully we were able to rein it in the statutes. But now they're coming at it fully, telling us what they want, which was discussed yesterday in committee, is that they are moving this so-called Equal Rights Amendment forward to, quote, like, protect their community, is one thing that Representative Finke said. He said, this isn't going to pass out of this committee. I know that, but I'm going to keep pushing this forward because my community exists and my community needs that. And his community is the LGBTQ plus community.
Right. Well, ladies, I know that you need to leave here in a minute, but can you give us just a minute or two on the two women's sports bills before you have to go today?
I'll give a brief update, and I'll let Becca chime in on what happened on the floor and the status of those and the status of the ERA. Briefly, the House was able to put forward the two actually bills that would protect women and girls in sports. One of them was in the education provisions. So this is tackling what the Minnesota State High School League did about 10 years ago when they changed their guidelines to allow males to participate in girls' sports. So Representative Peggy Scott brought forth a bill, and I worked very closely with her along with my colleague Rebecca to get this bill to committee and eventually to the floor. We actually had a number of young girls testify on the implications of this bill. We had one girl testify how she'd actually been harmed by a male athlete here in the state of Minnesota. Rebecca and I are in contact with other people that have shared the same stories. So there is a need to protect these girls and to make sure that the Minnesota State High School League doesn't keep pushing this crazy policy that they've had that allows males to compete in girls' sports. And there's definitely added pressure with the Trump administration's threat that you don't fix this, we're going to take away your federal funding. And then there was another bill that was also introduced that simply said the exemptions that already exist in the Minnesota Human Rights Act for not only girls in educational opportunities, but all women and all opportunities in sports for women and girls need to be protected. And at the very least, allow girls and women's sports teams to be girls if that's what they choose. It's not actually saying you can only have girls in female sports, but it's saying at least do not penalize unjustly or put on legal fees and other sort of compliance mechanisms. Don't attach those to girls that want to have girls teams. Live and let live at the very least. And Rebecca, you can share what happened with those bills.
I would be happy to. Yes, they were both tabled. So they were brought to the House floor, and this is a long story as to how we got to the tie that we're at right now in the House of Representatives. But at the time, there were only 67 House Republicans and 66 House Democrats. And because they did not have the required 68 vote majority to pass a bill, and unfortunately, this issue is so partisan that the 67 Democrats voted for, or excuse me, 67 Republicans voted for it, 66 Democrats voted against it, and without the sufficient votes to pass it, they had to table it, both for the HF12 and HF1233. And so those have been tabled, which essentially means they could pick them up off the House floor at any time during a session and to vote on it if they feel like they have the votes to pass it. For the ERA, we're nowhere near that far, which is a huge blessing. It got tabled in the first committee stop because it was voted upon. The vote was on a tie. So you had equal Democrats voting for it, the ERA, and Republicans voting against it. And so that has been tabled in that committee. And so I believe that's where it's going to stay. I mean, we've seen such crazy things in the past couple of years, but I think that's where it's going to stay for now in 2025.
All right.
This is an extra added note there. I think that it's important to recognize that while this didn't pass off the floor and didn't become law, I mean, 2023 and 2024 was brutal, especially for those of us on this call that have unique interests and care a lot about our faith and our ability to live it out here. So the fact that we could have these discussions through these bills about how important it is to recognize the differences between men and women has been quite incredible. We're not used to actually being proactive. We've been so much on the defense. So that was actually encouraging to get that conversation out. And as you probably know, about 80% of the country is with us on women's sports. And again, that's an issue about men and women. So I think if we keep talking about this in a reasonable way and help to educate people and help them understand how this actually impacts women, girls, and people of faith, I think there's a chance that we can move the needle. So keep up what you're doing, guys. I think that these podcasts and all of the discussions and webinars that you do are very helpful.
Well, again, thank you so much for being with us today, Renee and Becca, and for all that you do. And because it really is a good work. You're doing a good work. You're fighting a good fight. And it really affects all of us in the state of Minnesota. So we're very blessed to have you on our team.
We're blessed to be on the team with you.
Yeah. Well, guys.
7 stars in the legislature. Thank you. And Gracie, your testimony is quite incredible. I remember being at the event a couple years ago. And so just want to thank you for that also. It's really encouraging.
Yeah.
Glory to God.
Yes. Well, we're going to keep talking about this, folks, because it is important. And it's kind of interesting that we have to spend so much time focusing on what is a man and what is a woman. It seems like a pretty simple thing for a lot of us, but it's become an issue. And like I said at the beginning, it's an image of God issue. And the image of God is, it's our true north, it's how we are to live on the earth and represent God and bear his image. So these are of the utmost importance, these issues. And so that's it for today. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. We'll be back next week for another edition of Time for Agape.